Hey, welcome back, and if it's your first time here, just welcome. In this video we're going to be looking at camera lenses. Now this is just a beginner's guide, but even if you know photography a bit, stick around because you might learn a few things. So lenses fall into three main categories. There's wide angle, there's standard, and then there's telephoto. Now splitting that down very basically, a wide angle lens allows you to see wider than the human eye. A standard lens lets you see the same as a human eye, and a telephoto lens allows you to see what the human eye can concentrate on so you can pick out bits of a scene. So lenses are split into two main camps. The most common these days are these, zoom lenses, but you also get prime lenses like this one and this one. Zooms are sometimes referred to as a kit lens because they come with a camera body to form a camera kit. They allow you to change the picture while standing still. Prime lenses are fixed, so you have to move your own legs to get nearer or further away. Now back in the day, wide angle was anything between 16mm and 35mm. Standard was anywhere between 35mm and 50mm, and anything above 85mm was considered a telephoto, in very simple terms. And then came digital and things changed. The reason was because some manufacturers made their sensors smaller. Lenses were originally made for film, and the most common format was 35mm. Now in digital terms, that is known as a full frame sensor or an FX sensor. However, the smaller sensors are known as DX sensors, and there's also now a thing called micro four thirds sensors, which is an even smaller sensor. Basically, the smaller the sensor, the more zoomed in the picture will be if the lens stays the same. Have a look at this image. It was taken with an 85mm lens and a full frame sensor. If I overlay a DX sensor, you can see not as much of the image is covered. So if I take away the area that wasn't covered by the sensor, you can see that there's a slight zoomed in effect. If I overlay a micro four thirds frame, you can see that the crop is even more. So what does that mean? Well, basically, if you use a full frame lens on a camera with a DX sensor, be aware that there's a crop factor. So for example, this is a 20mm lens. If I use this on a full frame sensor, that's what I would get. On a DX sensor, I would get somewhere in the region of 24mm, depending on the camera I use, because different cameras have different sized sensors, and therefore the crop factor is slightly different. It might be 1.2, might be 1.4, something like that. And knowing that crop factor will tell you the apparent or equivalent focal length of your lens that you're using. However, be careful using a DX designed lens on an FX sensor camera, because the edges of the frame, which the lens isn't designed to cover, will appear as a dark vignette. FX lenses work brilliantly on DX sensor cameras at the telephoto end. That's because a 300mm can look, depending on the crop factor of the sensor, like a 360 or even a 400mm, meaning you can zoom in more on sport or wildlife to get a better image. However, at the wide angle end, you need to go wider than you expect. Therefore, DX and micro four thirds sensor cameras have wide angle lenses somewhere between 10 and 14mm, whereas a full frame camera, that would be the equivalent range of around a 16 or an 18 or a 20mm lens. Okay, let's take a look at a lens in detail. Now, I'll just take off the lens hood. Now, on here, you'll see the maker's name. This is a Nikon, and they call their lenses Nikon lenses. Yours could say Canon, it could say Pentax, it could say Sigma, it could say Tamron, it could say Sony, and the many other makers that there are out there. Then there's going to be some letters. Now this one says ED, and then also down here it says G. This one, for example, says D. These are codes the makers use to show what type of glass was used and what type of lens it is. Whatever lens you have, be it Nikon, Canon, Sony, etc., there is a glossary of terms on the company's website which will tell you what those codes mean. Now I'll put a link to the more common ones in the box down below. In this case, the ED stands for extra low dispersion glass, and the G denotes that the lens doesn't have an aperture ring, and I'll come to what that is later. However, the most important marking perhaps is the focal length. The focal length is denoted in millimeters no matter where you are in the world. So the focal length indicates whether the lens is a wide angle or a telephoto. Basically, the lower the number, the more wide angle the lens. So this one, being a prime lens, is set to 85mm only. This one is a zoom lens and works from 24mm to 85mm. That means it can smoothly change focal length and zoom in or zoom out to change the look of the picture. Now this is where you can see that focal length does not correlate with the overall size of the lens. So you can see that when this one is set to 85mm, so this one will see exactly the same as this one will see, but you can see the size doesn't match. The reason is because focal length is a mathematical calculation and denotes where the lens converges the light rays to make the picture on the sensor. So the light enters here, it travels through the lens and then gets bent and will converge somewhere back here, and this one, the glass in this one, makes it converge in exactly the same place, which is why it's 85mm. This one, being a 20mm lens, does exactly the same thing. It converges the light, but it will be 20mm from the sensor. So basically the lens size or the diameter will not tell you what the focal length is. Only the markings on the lens will do that. Next along is the maximum aperture, and that's generally along from the focal length. There are two types. On a prime lens or a more expensive zoom lens, there will be a single aperture. This is the widest aperture the lens is capable of achieving. This one, for example, is a 1:1.8. The 1: shows that the 1.8 is a fraction, and that's all that is. On many zoom lenses, the run-of-the-mill ones anyway, like this one, you will see that the maximum aperture is variable. So this one is 3.5 at the wide angle end, and then 4.5 at the zoomed in end. So when this is on a camera, you can zoom through the focal length range and you can see the maximum aperture change as the focal length changes. And that's because an aperture is not a fixed size hole, but a measure of brightness, so is influenced by the focal length and the makeup of the lens. Somewhere there will be a diameter symbol and a number. Now on this lens, it's on the back here, and this is the diameter of the front screw thread, and that will tell you what lens cap to buy, and more importantly what size filters to buy to go onto this lens. Lastly, there may be markings like this, VR. VR stands for vibration reduction and is Nikon's image stabilization system. Canon users will see IS, which stands for image stabilization. Sigma users will see OS, and other manufacturers have their own sayings. Basically they all mean the same thing. The lens will try and iron out any small imperfections in movement to try and create a sharp image. It will not correct for really bad motion blur. Don't count on it to deal with a 400mm lens taking 1/25 of a second, because it just won't be able to cope with that. Very often lenses with image stabilization also have a VR or OS or IS on off switch, so you can turn it on and off, and I would turn it off when you're dealing with a tripod and on when you're hand holding. Some, like this one, will also have an AF on off switch as well. Now a lot of cameras have an AF on off switch on them, so this is pretty much redundant, but it's still a function that appears on some lenses. On the body of the lens will be at least one movable ring. One will be the zoom control, and this can be either a twist like this one, or it can be a push and a pull. And many lenses will have a manual focusing ring, and that's generally near the focus window. The numbers in here are in feet for you Americans and Liberians, and in meters for the rest of the world, and they show where the lens is focused. Now on all lenses there will be in there a sideways 8. Now that stands for infinity. Now unlike Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story, there is no infinity and beyond. Infinity basically is the furthest distance that light hits the lens at an angle. Anything over that and light is coming straight through the lens and doesn't need to be bent, and this is deemed to be the far distance. So if you're taking pictures of the moon at night and you're having trouble focusing, just set your lens to manual focus and then infinity, and everything in the far distance will be in focus. Now the thing that shows a lens's true value to the photographer is very often the minimum focusing distance. So we'll take both of these lenses. These are both 85mm lenses. And we'll take this one first. This is the prime lens. And as you can see, the minimum focusing distance on this is 0.85 meters, which is about 3 feet. This one can focus down to 0.38 meters, which is just under 1.5 feet. So if focusing closer is more important to your photography, then pay attention to the minimum focusing distance on the lens. Below or above the window could be some other numbers. Now in this case it's 11 and 16, and this shows the depth of field that those apertures can achieve. To learn more about depth of field, see my aperture video, and I'll put that up in a link up there. But basically depth of field is what appears to be in focus in your picture. So if you use f11, less will be in focus than if you used f16. Older lenses and some of the new ones also have a movable ring at the base, and this is an aperture ring, and it's a way, and I'll show you, of opening up and closing down the aperture in the lens. The vast majority of modern cameras do not use the aperture ring, and so they're pretty much redundant, and all except the oldest lenses have a lock which will allow you to lock the aperture at the smallest setting, and therefore the camera can take control of the aperture. Now some lenses have a series of 6 to 9 numbers somewhere on the body. This one's on the back, and this is the serial number for this particular lens. Now right on the bottom is the reason you cannot use a Nikon lens on a Canon or a Sony or a Pentax camera. This is the lens mount. This piece of engineering is designed so that this lens only fits a particular make of camera. Now this is a key piece of information, particularly if you're using a third-party lens, so something like a Sigma or a Tamron. You need to know what lens mount it's got to know which camera it fits. There's no point in buying a Sigma lens to go onto your Nikon camera if it's designed to go onto a Canon camera. So knowing the lens mount fitted to the bottom of the lens will know which camera make it will fit. So that's just a look at lenses. What type you buy will depend on what you want to take pictures of, and that's really for another video. If you want to know how to clean your lenses and produce the sharpest pictures possible, try saying that when you're drunk, then check out my pin sharp pictures video. I'll put a link up there. I hope you got something out of this video. If you liked it, hit me a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.